After my husband, a retired Army colonel, passed away, my mother-in-law looked me dead in the eye and said she wanted the house, the family business, and everything he left behind. My attorney urged me to fight. I simply shook my head and told him to let her have it. The entire courtroom thought I had lost my mind. At the final hearing, I signed every single document, handing over a $10 million estate. My mother-in-law smiled like she had just won the lottery. Then the judge closed the file, looked at her attorney, and asked one single question that destroyed her entire life. My name is Jocelyn, and I am 33 years old. I am a forensic accountant, a profession that trains you to spot the hidden lies buried beneath perfectly balanced numbers. But the most elaborate fraud I ever encountered was sitting right in my own living room, orchestrated by the people who called themselves family. It had been exactly 24 hours since I buried my husband David. He was 45 years old, a highly decorated retired United States Army colonel who had survived multiple combat tours, only to succumb to a sudden massive cardiac event right in our kitchen. My heart was completely shattered. I had spent the last day operating in a thick fog of pure grief. But the moment I pulled into the driveway of our $1.5 million home in Virginia, that fog instantly evaporated. A massive commercial moving truck was parked right on my front lawn, its heavy tires crushing the hydrangeas David and I had planted together just last spring. The front door was wide open. I stepped out of my car, my black morning dress still damp from the cemetery rain, and walked inside. The house was absolute chaos. My brother-in-law Terrence, a slick African-American commercial real estate developer who always wore suits that cost more than my first car, was standing in the center of my living room. He was literally using a laser tape measure against the walls, calculating dimensions. My sister-in-law Caroline was loudly directing a crew of movers to start hauling away my antique dining chairs. "What is going on here?" I asked, my voice trembling but loud enough to stop the room. My mother-in-law Beatrice stepped out of the kitchen. She was dressed impeccably in dark silk, her posture rigid and her expression utterly devoid of any sorrow for her dead son. She walked over to the marble island and slammed a thick manila folder onto the counter. "What is going on is that we are reclaiming what rightfully belongs to this family," Beatrice said, her tone dripping with pure venom. "I found this in David's old safe. It is a legally binding will drawn up 12 years ago, long before he ever made the mistake of meeting you." I stared at the document from across the room. "David updated his will after we got married. You know that. He left everything to me." "I know no such thing," Beatrice snapped, crossing her arms. "As far as the law is concerned right now, David left this house and his private security firm Apex Tactical to his real family. The company he bled for belongs to us. You have exactly 2 hours to pack a single suitcase and get out of my house." Terrence chuckled from across the room, pocketing his tape measure. "Come on, Jocelyn. You have to admit the ride was fun while it lasted. But Apex Tactical is a $10 million operation now. You really thought we would just let some working-class accountant walk away with the family empire?" I felt the blood rushing to my ears. I had spent the last 3 years helping David build Apex Tactical from the ground up. I managed the books, stayed up until 3 in the morning, balancing the payroll, and supported him through the severe post-traumatic stress that had forced his early military retirement. They had never once offered him a dime or a single moment of their time when he was struggling to adapt to civilian life. Now that the company was turning a massive profit, they swooped in to claim the glory. I walked past Beatrice, ignoring her glaring eyes, and headed toward the fireplace mantel. Sitting in a velvet display box was David's Purple Heart medal. It was the only thing I truly cared about in this massive, echoing house. It was the symbol of his sacrifice, the medal he held in his hands on the nights the nightmares kept him awake. I reached out to take it. Before my fingers could even brush the velvet, Caroline lunged forward and snatched the box right out of my hands. "Do not touch that," Caroline hissed, clutching the medal to her chest. Her eyes scanned me with absolute disgust. "You only married the colonel for his pension and his status. You never belonged in our world. You are just a parasite who thought she hit the jackpot. Well, the gold digging stops today. Leave the metal, pack your cheap clothes, and get out before Terrence calls the police to have you arrested for trespassing. You cannot do this, I said, looking at Terrence. I am his legal wife. I have rights to this property under Virginia law. Terrence smirked, pulling his phone from his pocket and waving it at me. I already filed an emergency ex parte probate freeze using the old will Jocelyn. I know the right judges in this county. Your joint accounts are locked. Your credit cards are frozen. You have absolutely nothing. Now, do you want to walk out of here quietly? Or do you want me to have you escorted out in handcuffs in front of the entire neighborhood? For a brief moment, the sheer cruelty of their actions threatened to break me completely. I looked at Beatrice standing tall and arrogant, fully believing she had outsmarted me. I looked at Caroline greedily holding the only piece of my husband's bravery. I looked at Terrence calculating his impending wealth with cold, hard greed. They expected me to scream. They expected me to drop to my knees and beg for mercy. They wanted the satisfaction of watching me fight a losing battle against their money and their influence. But I am a forensic accountant. I do not operate on emotion. I operate on data strategy and cold, hard facts. I stopped protesting. I let my shoulders slump perfectly, playing the role of the defeated, broken widow. I slowly nodded my head. Fine, I whispered, making sure my voice cracked, just enough to sound thoroughly crushed. I will pack my things. Beatrice smiled, a terrifyingly triumphant expression spreading across her face. 2 hours, she repeated. Do not make me tell you twice. I walked upstairs to the master bedroom. I did not take 2 hours. I took exactly 15 minutes. I packed a small duffel bag with a few changes of clothes, my laptop, and my personal identification documents. I did not take any jewelry. I did not take the expensive designer bags David had bought me. I left everything exactly as it was. When I walked back downstairs, they were already loudly discussing which contractor to hire to tear down the walls I had painted with David. I did not say a single word. I walked straight out the front door and into the pouring rain. The cold water soaked through my black dress instantly, but I did not rush to my car. Instead, I stood in the driveway, pulled my phone from my pocket, and opened a text message thread with my personal estate attorney, Jonathan. My fingers hovered over the keyboard for a second. Inside that house, my in-laws thought they had just secured a $10 million empire and a luxury mansion. They thought they had left me with absolutely nothing. They had no idea that they had just aggressively fought for the privilege of walking right into a financial slaughterhouse. I typed out a single message and hit send. They took the bait, initiate Protocol 0. The rain lashed against my windshield as I drove away from the neighborhood I had called home for the last 3 years. I did not look back in the rearview mirror. I knew Beatrice and Caroline were probably already popping a bottle of expensive champagne in my kitchen, celebrating their supposed victory. My phone sat silent on the passenger seat. The message I had sent to my attorney Jonathan was the only lifeline I needed right now. I needed a place to sleep. Driving through the storm, I crossed the county line and eventually pulled into the parking lot of a cheap roadside motel. The neon vacancy sign flickered aggressively through the downpour. It was a place that smelled faintly of industrial bleach and stale cigarette smoke, a stark contrast to the sprawling Virginia estate I had just been evicted from. I walked up to the plexiglass window and handed the clerk my driver's license and a personal credit card. He swiped it through the machine. A sharp mechanical beep echoed in the tiny lobby. Declined. The clerk looked up at me, his eyes filled with a mixture of annoyance and pity. I reached into my bag and pulled out another card, a premium travel card tied directly to David's business accounts. I handed it over. He swiped it again. Declined. A cold, heavy knot formed in my stomach. I took my cards back, muttered a quiet apology to the clerk, and walked back out into the freezing rain. I locked myself inside my car and pulled out my phone. I opened my banking application, praying it was just a security fraud alert triggered by my unusual location. Instead, a bright red banner flashed across the top of my screen. Account frozen pending probate verification. I tapped on my personal checking account. Frozen. I checked the joint savings account I shared with David. Frozen. I checked the emergency fund. frozen. Terrence had not been bluffing. My brother-in-law had moved with terrifying speed. He had leveraged his high-level commercial real estate connections, found a judge willing to expedite a weekend filing, and used that outdated 12-year-old will to place an emergency lock on every single marital asset. He had effectively cut off my oxygen supply before I even realized I was suffocating. I opened my wallet and pulled out the cash tucked inside. 2 wrinkled $20 bills and 2 singles. I was a 33-year-old woman who had just managed the finances of a $10 million company, and I had exactly $42 to my name. I drove away from the motel and found a well-lit parking lot behind a 24-hour grocery store. I turned off the engine to save gas, pushed my seat all the way back, and pulled my damp coat tight against my chest. The winter chill easily seeped through the glass windows. As I lay there in the dark, shivering in the very same black dress I had worn to bury my husband, a profound sense of familiarity washed over me. This was not the first time Beatrice had tried to publicly humiliate me by cutting off my resources. 5 years ago, just 3 days before David and I were supposed to get married, I received a frantic phone call from our wedding venue. Beatrice had gone behind my back, impersonated me to the catering company, and canceled our entire food and beverage order. When I drove to her house to confront her, she simply smiled at me over her teacup. She calmly told me that my working-class menu selections were an embarrassment to her family's elite social standing. She wanted to remind me right before I walked down the aisle that she controlled the checkbook, she controlled the social circles, and she controlled the power. She had wanted me to panic. She had wanted me to cry and beg her to fix it. David had stepped in immediately and handled it, but the lesson had been permanently etched into my brain that day. Beatrice uses money as a weapon to break people. She isolates her targets, strips them of their comfort, and waits for them to surrender. But Beatrice fundamentally misunderstood who she was dealing with. She thought stripping me of my credit cards and tossing me into the rain would leave me defenseless. She thought I was just a grieving widow. She forgot that I am a forensic accountant. I do not break under pressure. I follow the numbers. When the sun finally crested over the horizon, casting a pale gray light across the asphalt parking lot, I did not shed a single tear. I walked into the grocery store, washed my face with cold water in the public restroom, and used 2 of my single-dollar bills to buy a black coffee. Then I got back into my car and drove. I did not drive to a women's shelter. I did not drive to Jonathan's law office to beg for a temporary loan. I merged onto the highway and drove 40 miles outside of the city limits, heading toward a heavily forested, unmarked industrial park. I pulled up to the security gate of a private subterranean data storage facility. It was a location that did not exist on any public directory or GPS map. I parked my car, walked down a concrete ramp, and approached the reinforced steel door of the underground server room. The scanner beside the door required advanced biometric verification and a highly specific physical key to bypass the firewall. I reached under my collar and pulled out the silver chain resting against my skin. Attached to it were David's old military dog tags. A month before he died, when he first started suspecting what his family was doing behind his back, David had an encrypted microchip embedded directly inside the metal plate of his tags. He told me that if anything ever happened to him, this was the only key that mattered. I pressed the dog tags against the black glass of the scanner. A green light flashed, acknowledging the encrypted chip. The heavy vault doors hissed open, granting me access to the private server that held every single financial secret my husband's family had ever tried to bury. The glow of the underground server monitors bathed the concrete room in a pale blue light. I spent 3 hours downloading every single encrypted file my husband had secured before his heart gave out. I did not review all the ledgers right then. I simply secured the data onto a heavily encrypted hard drive, slipped David's dog tags back under my shirt, and drove back toward the city limits. I needed to get to work. My job at the high-end forensic accounting firm was my sanctuary, and the only source of income I thought I had left. Walking into the polished glass lobby of my firm, I expected the usual quiet hum of calculators and murmured client meetings. Instead, the environment felt entirely hostile. The receptionist avoided my eyes, suddenly finding her keyboard fascinating. The office manager quickly approached me before I even reached my cubicle. She told me Mr. Bradley, the managing partner, needed to see me in his office immediately. I walked into the corner office to find Mr. Bradley looking deeply uncomfortable. He did not offer me a seat. He simply turned his computer monitor around to face me. A video was playing on the screen. It was my sister-in-law, Caroline. She was sitting in my living room wearing a black lace mourning veil she had certainly not bothered to wear to the actual funeral. She was sobbing uncontrollably into the camera, performing a masterful tragedy for her social media followers. Through fake tears, she told the internet a horrifying, entirely fabricated story. She claimed I had systematically isolated her decorated military brother during his final months. She accused me of withholding his vital heart medication to speed up his death so I could steal the family fortune and completely cut out his loving mother. The video had gone viral overnight. It had millions of views. The comment section was a relentless stream of strangers calling me a monster, a gold digger, and a murderer. Mr. Bradley paused the video and looked at me with an expression of deep regret. He explained that our top corporate clients had been calling the front desk in an absolute panic since 6 in the morning. They did not want a suspected murderer and thief handling their sensitive financial audits. My personal assets were already frozen by the probate court, and now my professional reputation was being publicly butchered. Mr. Bradley told me his hands were tied. The firm could not risk the public relations nightmare. He placed me on indefinite, unpaid administrative leave effective immediately. I had to hand over my security badge and pack my desk. I walked out of the towering glass building holding a small cardboard box containing my coffee mug and a few framed photos of David. The rain from yesterday had cleared, leaving a humid, heavy heat pressing down on the asphalt. As I walked toward my modest sedan, a loud, aggressive engine revved right behind me. A brand-new jet-black Porsche pulled across the striped parking lines, deliberately blocking my path. The tinted window rolled down. Terrence was sitting behind the wheel. He was wearing a tailored navy suit, looking every bit the slick, untouchable real estate developer. A massive grin stretched across his face. He looked like a man who had just conquered the world. He laughed out loud, casually tapping the leather steering wheel of his expensive new toy. He told me Caroline had just texted him the wonderful news about my sudden unemployment. He mocked me, asking how the fiercely independent working woman was going to survive now that she was a broke, disgraced widow living in her car. Terrence reached into his designer jacket pocket, pulled out a crisp $50 bill and tossed it out the window. It fluttered onto the wet pavement and landed right at my feet. "Take it for gas money," Terrence sneered. "I know the shelters fill up fast this time of day, and I would hate for David's precious wife to run out of fuel on the side of the highway." They expected me to break. They expected me to scream, to throw my cardboard box at his windshield, or to break down sobbing right there in the parking lot. They wanted the satisfaction of watching my complete and utter destruction. I looked down at the money. I calmly bent my knees, picked up the $50 bill, and tucked it neatly into my blazer pocket. I looked back up at Terrence and offered him a polite, perfectly warm smile. "Thank you so much, Terrence," I said, keeping my voice entirely devoid of anger. "You are incredibly generous." I ran my eyes over the sleek, aggressive lines of his new car. I stepped slightly closer to his window. "This is a beautiful vehicle," I noted casually. "A brand new Porsche 911 Turbo. The retail price sits right around $200,000 after taxes and the custom interior packages you clearly selected." I leaned in just an inch closer, holding his gaze. "I find your purchase absolutely fascinating, Terrence. The commercial real estate market has been in a catastrophic freefall for the last 8 months. Your primary lenders have pulled back on funding. Commercial interest rates are actively crushing developers across the state. In fact, public records show your specific firm has not closed a single major property deal in over a year. Yet here you are buying luxury sports cars in straight cash while aggressively fighting for a probate freeze on my modest banking accounts." Terrence stopped smiling. I kept my voice perfectly flat and analytical. "I just wanted to let you know that kind of sudden reckless spending when a business is actively failing usually leaves a very specific, very loud paper trail. And the authorities who look into those paper trails do not care about viral social media videos." The smug arrogance vanished from Terrence's face instantly. His jaw tightened, and his hands gripped the steering wheel so hard his knuckles turned gray. The cocky, untouchable brother-in-law suddenly looked like a man who realized he had just stepped squarely onto a live landmine. I smiled politely, turned my back on him, and walked toward my car. I left him sitting in his expensive new trap, sweating in the midday heat, completely unaware of the storm I was about to bring down on his head. Terrence was not a smart man, but he possessed the dangerous and erratic energy of a cornered animal. After our brief encounter in the parking lot, he realized I knew far too much about his failing commercial real estate deals. He panicked. Instead of backing down, he decided to assert his dominance the only way a bully knows how. He decided to attack the one person he thought I could not protect. He went after my 68-year-old mother, Helen. 2 years ago, David had purchased a modest two-bedroom bungalow under the Apex Tactical corporate umbrella. He let my mother live there completely rent-free as a quiet thank you for the years she spent helping us while he was recovering from his combat injuries. Because Terrence had used the outdated will to aggressively seize control of all corporate assets, he technically now held the deed to my mother's home. I was sitting in my car outside a coffee shop, carefully reviewing the encrypted files I had downloaded from the underground server when my phone buzzed violently. It was a social media live stream notification. It was from Caroline. The title of the video made my blood run cold. Cleaning House of the Freeloaders. I tapped the notification. The shaky, high-definition camera footage showed the familiar front yard of my mother's bungalow. Terrence was standing on the porch with two burly men wearing matching gray polo shirts. They were physically carrying a heavy armchair out the front door and tossing it onto the grass. I threw my car into drive, broke at least 3 speed limits, and sped across town. By the time I pulled up to the curb, the front lawn was covered in cardboard boxes, cheap lamps, and scattered clothing. Caroline was standing in the middle of the yard with her phone held high in the air, recording every single second of the humiliation for her thousands of followers. Beatrice was standing under the shade of a large oak tree near the driveway. She was holding a designer sun umbrella, watching the chaotic scene unfold with absolute, unadulterated delight. I ran across the grass, my chest heaving, playing the role of the desperate broken daughter to absolute perfection. "Terrence, you have to stop this," I yelled, rushing up to the porch. "You need a legal court order for an eviction. You cannot just throw an elderly woman out onto the street without 30 days' notice." Terrence laughed loudly, stepping down the stairs to block my path. He flashed a piece of paper in my face. It was a forged eviction notice that he claimed I had ignored. He knew the paperwork was highly illegal. He also knew that fighting a wrongful eviction in civil court takes months of time and thousands of dollars in legal fees. He was banking on the fact that my assets were completely frozen, leaving me entirely powerless to fight back. Caroline shoved her phone camera right into my face. "This is what happens when gold diggers try to infiltrate a legacy military family," Caroline announced to her live viewers, her voice dripping with fake righteousness. "They bring their entire low-class family along to feast on our wealth. We are finally taking out the trash." My mother Helen stood quietly on the sidewalk near my car. She was clutching a small handbag against her chest, looking frail and overwhelmed by the noise. Beatrice slowly walked over to her, her expensive heels clicking against the concrete. She looked my mother up and down with pure, unfiltered disgust. "You should be utterly ashamed of yourself," Helen, Beatrice said, her voice carrying across the lawn. "I always knew your daughter was a parasite, but seeing you live here for free on my dead son's dime makes it clear exactly where she learned her behavior. You raised a catastrophic failure of a woman. Now grab your garbage and get off my property." I rushed over and grabbed my mother's arm, pulling her slightly behind me. I let my shoulders shake. I forced a few tears to spill down my cheeks, making sure Caroline caught my crying on her live stream. "Please, Beatrice," I begged, letting my voice crack with manufactured desperation. "Just give us until the end of the weekend. She is an older woman. We have nowhere else to go. Do not do this to her." Beatrice simply smiled, a cold and terrifying expression of pure victory. "Your housing problems are no longer my concern," Beatrice said. She turned her back to me and ordered Terrence to finish changing the locks on the front door. The three of them got into their luxury cars and drove away, leaving my mother and me standing on the curb completely surrounded by a mountain of discarded boxes. As soon as their tail lights disappeared around the corner, my tears stopped instantly. I stood up perfectly straight. I wiped the moisture from my cheeks and let out a long, steady breath. I looked at my mother. Helen looked back at me, dropping her frightened posture, and let out a soft, warm laugh. I opened the passenger door of my sedan for her. We got inside and pulled away from the curb, leaving every single cardboard box exactly where it was on the lawn. We drove 20 minutes across town to a highly secure, beautifully landscaped luxury condominium complex. We pulled into a private garage and took the elevator up to a spacious, sunlit corner unit. David and I had fully paid off this condo 5 months ago. We placed it under a completely private, irrevocable trust that Terrence and Beatrice knew absolutely nothing about. Walking inside the space was immaculate. All of my mother's actual furniture, her delicate family heirlooms, her vintage photo albums, and her important legal documents were perfectly arranged in the living room. We had secretly packed and moved the real items 3 days ago. The boxes sitting on that bungalow lawn were filled with nothing but old thrift store junk-torn blankets and heavy rocks. Terrence, Caroline, and Beatrice thought they had just publicly humiliated me. They thought they had left my mother completely homeless on the streets. They thought they had won. They did not realize I was meticulously arranging the board for my final checkmate. I had barely finished unpacking my mother's vintage teacups in her new secure condominium when my phone lit up with a text message. It was from Terrence. The aggressive, mocking tone he had used in the parking lot and during the fake eviction was completely gone. Instead, the message read like it had been written by a completely different person. Jocelyn, I am sorry about how things went down today. Tensions are high. Let us grab lunch tomorrow. Just the two of us. We need to figure this out like adults. I stared at the screen and let out a quiet, knowing laugh. Terrence was panicking. He had successfully used the outdated 12-year-old will to get the probate judge to freeze all of my marital assets, cutting off my access to the cash. But in his blind rush to financially paralyze me, Terrence had completely overlooked a massive legal hurdle. Until I officially signed a waiver surrendering my spousal elective share, the probate freeze also locked him and Beatrice out of Apex Tactical's primary operating accounts. The $10 million company they thought they had just conquered was currently frozen solid. Terrence could not touch a single dime of the corporate funds. And a man who has taken out $4.2 million in illicit fraudulent commercial loans cannot afford to have his cash flow frozen. I agreed to meet him the next afternoon at an upscale, dimly lit steakhouse in downtown Richmond, the kind of overpriced establishment where men in expensive suits go to make quiet, desperate deals. When I arrived, Terrence was already sitting in a leather booth near the back. He looked exhausted. The polished, untouchable aura he usually projected was cracking around the edges. He had a glass of bourbon in his hand, and he was tapping his heavy gold watch against the wooden table with a frantic, nervous rhythm. I slid into the booth across from him, keeping my posture perfectly relaxed. "Jocelyn," he said, flashing a highly practiced, entirely fake smile. "Thank you for coming. I ordered you a sparkling water. I did not touch the glass. I simply folded my hands on the table and waited." Terrence leaned forward, dropping his voice into a conspiratorial whisper. He was shifting into the good cop routine, a manipulation tactic so transparent I almost felt embarrassed for him. "Listen, I want to apologize for Beatrice and Caroline," Terrence said, shaking his head as if he were burdened by their behavior. "You know how entitled they are. They grew up with silver spoons in their mouths. They do not understand how the real world works, how hard it is for people like us to survive." I raised an eyebrow, letting him dig his own grave. "We outsiders have to stick together, Jocelyn," he continued, leaning in closer. "You and I, we know what it means to hustle." Beatrice looks at me, a successful black man from a working-class neighborhood, and she still just sees a thug in a nice suit. She looks at you, and she sees a peasant trying to climb the social ladder. They will never respect us, but we can help each other out right now. It was a masterful, sickening display of manipulation. He was actively trying to weaponize his own race and my working-class background to create a false sense of solidarity. He wanted me to believe we were in the same boat fighting the same elitist monsters. He conveniently forgot that just yesterday he had tried to throw my elderly mother onto the street for a live stream audience. I kept my expression entirely neutral. "What exactly is it you want, Terrence?" He took a slow sip of his bourbon. "We need you to sign the probate waiver, Jocelyn. Just sign the document handing over the house and Apex Tactical to Beatrice. If you do that quietly without dragging this through a messy court battle, I will personally guarantee you a highly paid consulting job at the company. I can authorize a $50,000 salary for you starting next week." He smiled, acting like he was handing me a life raft. And in exchange, Terrence added casually, trying to slip it into the conversation as if it were a minor detail, "You just need to quietly hand over the login credentials to David's military pension accounts and his private life insurance policies. We know the colonel had a massive nest egg tucked away. Just hand over the passwords, sign the waiver, and we can all walk away happy." I stared at him, dissecting the sheer magnitude of his greed. He did not just want the $10 million company. He wanted David's blood money. He wanted the private funds my husband had earned through decades of combat tours and severe trauma. Terrence was drowning in his own fraudulent commercial debt, and he viewed my dead husband's pension as his personal bailout fund. I did not scream. I did not throw my water in his face. I simply picked up my purse and prepared to leave. "I will not be taking a consulting job at Apex Tactical," I said, my voice dripping with icy calm. "And I will not be handing over David's private military accounts." Terrence's fake smile vanished. His eyes hardened into a desperate glare. "Jocelyn, do not be stupid. If you fight us in court, Beatrice will bleed you dry in legal fees. You will end up with absolutely nothing." I stood up from the booth. "I am not going to fight you in court, Terrence. I have no intention of battling Beatrice for the house or the company. You will get everything you asked for. I will sign the waiver, but I will only do it standing in front of a probate judge, where Beatrice officially and legally assumes absolute total responsibility for the estate." Terrence let out a heavy breath, wiping a bead of sweat from his forehead. He thought I was just being stubborn about the legal formalities. He thought he had won. "Fine," he said, his shoulders dropping in relief. "Have your lawyer set up the hearing. Just get it done quickly." I turned my back on him and walked out of the dining room, but I did not leave the restaurant. I stepped into the shadowed alcove near the coat check and waited. 2 minutes later, Terrence got up from our booth. He did not head for the exit. Instead, he walked briskly toward the very back of the restaurant, slipping into a secluded private corner booth. Sitting in that booth was a man wearing a cheap suit with a thick, jagged scar running down the side of his neck. He was not a bank executive. He was not a traditional commercial lender. He was a notoriously ruthless private loan shark, known for financing desperate real estate developers who had been blacklisted by legitimate financial institutions. I pulled my phone from my purse, turned off the flash, and zoomed in on the booth. I snapped 3 crystal-clear high-resolution photos of Terrence furiously pleading with the man, gesturing wildly with his hands. Terrence's $4.2 million fraudulent debt was not just a numbers problem anymore. The bill was coming due, and the people he owed did not send collection letters. They sent enforcers. I slipped my phone back into my purse and walked out into the bright afternoon sun. The clock was ticking, and Terrence was running out of time. Terrence thought he had completely outsmarted me by dragging me into probate court. He wanted a judge to formally and publicly strip me of everything my husband had built. What he did not realize was that the courtroom was the exact stage I needed to trap him in a financial prison of his own making. My name is Jocelyn, and I am 33 years old. As a forensic accountant, I know that the best way to destroy a greedy man is to simply hand him the rope and let him tie the knot himself. The heavy oak doors of the Virginia probate court swung open, and I walked inside, wearing a plain gray suit I had bought on clearance years ago. I intentionally wore no makeup and pulled my hair back into a severe, simple style. I needed to look like a woman who had been thoroughly beaten down by life. My attorney, Jonathan, walked beside me, carrying a remarkably thin briefcase. We took our seats at the petitioner table in silence. On the other side of the aisle, my in-laws looked like they were attending a royal coronation. Beatrice sat perfectly straight, draped in expensive dark designer fabrics, her chin raised in absolute defiance. Caroline sat next to her wearing a smug smile and clutching a luxury handbag that cost more than most people make in a month. Terence, my African-American brother-in-law, sat at the edge of their table. He wore a custom-tailored suit that projected extreme wealth. But my trained eyes caught the subtle signs of a man operating under catastrophic stress. His right leg bounced nervously against the carpet. He kept checking his expensive watch, and a fine layer of sweat gathered at his temples despite the heavy air conditioning in the courtroom. He needed this court hearing to wrap up today. He needed access to the Apex Tactical corporate bank accounts immediately to pay off the ruthless private lenders I had seen him meeting with at the restaurant. Judge Mitchell, an older man with a stern face and a reputation for strict adherence to probate law, took his place at the bench. He banged his gavel and called the hearing to order. Immediately, Mr. Kensington stood up. He was Beatrice's high-priced aggressive estate lawyer, a man known for bullying opposing counsel into submission. He did not waste a single second before launching into a vicious, calculated character assassination. "Your Honor," Mr. Kensington began, his voice booming across the quiet courtroom. "We are here today to rectify a tragic injustice. My client Beatrice is the rightful heir to the estate of her late son, a highly decorated military hero. We have submitted a legally sound will that clearly outlines his intentions to keep his assets, including his $10 million private security firm, within his true family." Mr. Kensington paced in front of the judge, pointing a harsh finger in my direction. Sitting across from us is a woman who opportunistically preyed upon a traumatized veteran. She systematically isolated him from his loving mother and his devoted siblings. Now we are asking this court to expedite the transfer of all assets, specifically the corporate control of Apex Tactical, directly to my client today. The family business is suffering without leadership. It must continue operating smoothly, and any delay will cause irreparable financial harm to the legacy my client's son bled to build. It was a brilliant, disgusting performance. Caroline actually produced a fake tear and dabbed her eyes with a tissue. Beatrice nodded solemnly. Judge Mitchell read through the initial filings. He looked down at me from the bench, his expression softening with undeniable pity. He saw a young, exhausted widow sitting in a cheap suit being actively bulldozed by a wealthy, powerful family. "Mrs. Jocelyn," Judge Mitchell said, his voice surprisingly gentle, "the claims being made against you today are quite severe. The older will they have presented is highly contestable, given the timeline of your marriage. I see you have counsel present. Do you wish to file a formal injunction to block this transfer?" Jonathan stood up, playing his part perfectly. "Your Honor, I am here in a strictly advisory capacity today. Due to an emergency ex parte freeze placed on all joint accounts by the opposing party, my client has been stripped of all her financial resources. She cannot afford to retain me for a prolonged legal defense at this time." Judge Mitchell frowned, shooting a sharp, disapproving glare toward Mr. Kensington and Beatrice. He hated when wealthy families used aggressive legal tactics to starve out vulnerable widows. "Mrs. Jocelyn," the judge said, leaning forward, "I am perfectly willing to grant you a 30-day continuance. I can lift the freeze on a portion of your living expenses so you can gather the funds necessary to mount a proper legal defense. You do not have to surrender your husband's estate today." This was the moment. The trap was set, and I needed to spring it flawlessly. I slowly stood up. I allowed my hands to shake visibly, gripping the edge of the wooden table for support. I looked down at the floor, refusing to meet the judge's eyes, projecting nothing but absolute crushing defeat. "Your Honor," I said, making sure my voice stuttered slightly, "I do not want 30 days. I do not have the money to fight them, and I do not have the energy. I have not slept. I have barely eaten. I just want peace. If Beatrice wants the house and the company, she can have them. I will not contest the old will. I just want this nightmare to be over." A collective gasp echoed through the courtroom. Beatrice let out a loud, victorious scoff, whispering something cruel to Caroline. Mr. Kensington smiled proudly, assuming his aggressive intimidation tactics had broken me entirely. But Terence did not smile. He let out a massive audible breath of relief, wiping the sweat from his forehead. He practically leaned over the table, whispering frantically to Mr. Kensington to finalize the paperwork right now. Judge Mitchell stared at me in stunned silence. He looked back down at the documents, deeply troubled by my sudden surrender. He shook his head slowly. "Mrs. Jocelyn, you are signing away your right to a multi-million-dollar estate," the judge said sternly. "I cannot in good conscience allow a grieving widow to waive her spousal elective share under this kind of obvious emotional and financial duress. I will not finalize this transfer today." Terence shot up from his chair, completely abandoning courtroom decorum. "Your Honor, she just said she does not want it. The company needs my financial management right now. We need the accounts unfrozen today." Judge Mitchell slammed his gavel down, glaring at Terence. "You will speak when spoken to, sir," the judge warned. "I am mandating a formal recorded mediation session between all parties. It will take place in exactly 48 hours. If after that mediation, Mrs. Jocelyn still wishes to surrender her entire marital estate, I will sign the final decree. Until then, the assets remain frozen. Court is adjourned." As the judge walked out of the room, the panic radiating from Terence was intoxicating. 48 hours meant 2 more days of frozen corporate accounts, 2 more days of failing to pay back his ruthless private loan sharks, 2 more days of compounding highly illegal interest, pushing him closer to physical danger. He was visibly sweating, pacing behind the defense table like a trapped rat begging his lawyer to do something. I quietly gathered my purse and walked down the center aisle of the courtroom. My head was held high. I had just successfully bought the Internal Revenue Service and the federal authorities exactly 48 hours to finalize their tax evasion warrants. Terence thought he was waiting for a fortune, but he was actually just counting down the final minutes to his own destruction. I sat in the quiet, empty darkness of my temporary apartment, watching the 48-hour countdown tick away in my mind. Terence was suffocating under the immense pressure of his impending illicit loan payments, but the rest of my in-laws were completely oblivious to the financial guillotine swinging right above their necks. They thought the judge ordering a mandatory mediation session was just a minor annoying delay in their grand takeover. In fact, Caroline saw the judge's ruling as an absolute undeniable victory. Caroline decided that capturing the family estate and effectively leaving me homeless was a milestone worth celebrating immediately. That evening, my phone began vibrating endlessly with social media notifications. Despite everything she had done to me, Caroline had never bothered to block my accounts. She wanted me to see her triumph. She was throwing a massive, lavishly catered party right in my own backyard. I opened the live stream on my phone, keeping my face perfectly still. The beautiful stone patio David and I had built by hand was swarming with Beatrice's high society friends and Terence's shady commercial real estate associates. Waiters wearing crisp white button-down shirts were circulating through the crowd with silver trays of expensive champagne and imported caviar. Caroline was holding her phone high in the air, loudly boasting to the camera that they were putting the entire catering bill directly on the Apex Tactical corporate credit card. She laughed wildly, telling her thousands of followers that the company was under new management, and they were finally cleaning out the dead weight. I watched the screen with a completely blank expression. The reckless financial waste did not bother me in the slightest. Terence's fraudulent commercial loans had already dug that grave deep enough to bury them all. But then the video cut to the grand sweeping staircase inside the foyer, and the blood running through my veins turned freezing cold. Caroline strutted down the steps, holding a crystal flute of champagne in one hand. She was wearing my dead husband's formal military dress jacket. The dark green fabric hung loosely over her tight sequined designer party dress. The heavy brass medals David had bled for clinked sharply against her cheap costume jewelry. She twirled for her followers, striking ridiculous poses as she described the highly decorated military uniform as her brand new vintage chic aesthetic. She actually looked directly into the camera lens and called the jacket the spoils of war. Beatrice stood at the bottom of the stairs, clapping her hands together and cheering her daughter on, utterly disrespectful of the uniform her own son had worn with such intense pride. I stared at the glowing screen, my hands resting perfectly flat and still on my desk. I did not shed a single tear. I did not throw my phone across the room. Instead, my mind went back to a quiet, rainy Tuesday afternoon 3 years ago. David had been sitting on the edge of our mattress holding that exact green jacket in his hands. He was a brilliant, fearless man who had led battalions through the most dangerous, unforgiving combat zones on the planet. But that afternoon, his broad shoulders shook as he wept quietly into his hands. A severe spinal injury from a shrapnel blast combined with the heavy invisible toll of severe combat trauma had forced him into an early medical retirement. Folding that uniform for the final time had broken his heart into a million pieces. He treated those medals with absolute sacred reverence because they represented the men and women who had fought beside him and never made it back home. Now his spoiled, greedy, narcissistic sister was wearing his sacrifice as a cheap prop for internet clout. They wanted to play reckless games with my husband's legacy. It was time to show them exactly what happens when you disrespect a soldier's sacrifice. I closed the social media application on my phone and opened a secure, heavily encrypted terminal on my laptop. I plugged in the heavy-duty solid-state drive I had retrieved from the underground bunker. As a forensic accountant, I had spent years meticulously building the financial architecture for Apex Tactical. I knew every digital backdoor, every hidden server, and every shadow ledger Terrence mistakenly thought he had cleverly concealed from the world. My fingers flew across the keyboard with absolute precision. I bypassed Terrence's amateur sloppy firewalls in less than 3 minutes. I gained direct, undetected access to the primary accounting software installed on the desktop computers, sitting right inside the home office of the Virginia estate. Working quietly in the dark, I compiled a massive, undeniable data packet. It contained the exact routing numbers Terrence used to funnel company funds into his offshore shell companies. It contained the blatantly fraudulent commercial loan applications he had submitted using the marital home and the company assets as collateral. And most importantly, it contained irrefutable, heavily documented proof of massive, deliberate federal tax evasion spanning the last 3 years. I did not just save the files to a flash drive. I routed an anonymous, highly prioritized alert directly to the Criminal Investigation Division of the Internal Revenue Service. But I did not send it from my own laptop network. Using a secure remote access protocol, I triggered the data packet to transmit directly from the IP address of the Apex Tactical computers currently sitting inside Beatrice's newly acquired mansion. I watched the progress bar hit 100%. The alert was successfully transmitted. The federal authorities now possessed a digital smoking gun, and the geographical coordinates attached to that weapon pointed right at the very house where Caroline was currently drinking champagne and mocking a dead soldier. The 48-hour mediation window the judge had mandated was no longer just a delay. It was the exact amount of time the federal agents needed to process the evidence and secure their warrants. I closed my laptop, walked into my small kitchen, and poured myself a glass of cold water. Terrence thought he was fighting a grieving widow for control of a bank account. He did not realize I had just invited the federal government to his victory party. The 48-hour mediation window mandated by Judge Mitchell was officially up. I walked into the sleek glass-walled conference room of a neutral arbitration firm in downtown Richmond. The heavy mahogany table in the center of the room looked like a battlefield, and I was about to execute the most calculated surrender in probate history. My attorney, Jonathan, walked beside me carrying a surprisingly thin leather briefcase. We took our seats in silence. On the opposite side of the table sat the people who had made it their mission to destroy me. Beatrice and Caroline looked like they were attending a luxury spa retreat rather than a legal mediation. They sat casually sipping sparkling water and whispering to each other with smug, self-satisfied smiles. Terrence, however, looked entirely different. My African-American brother-in-law was pacing restlessly near the floor-to-ceiling windows. The polished, arrogant commercial real estate developer I had seen in the parking lot 2 days ago was completely gone. His custom-tailored suit looked wrinkled. A heavy layer of sweat coated his forehead, and his hands trembled slightly as he constantly checked his phone. The clock was ticking on his massive fraudulent commercial loan. The violent enforcers I had photographed him meeting with were clearly breathing down his neck. Terrence needed the Apex Tactical corporate accounts unfrozen today, or his life was going to be in genuine physical danger. Mr. Kensington, Beatrice's high-priced attorney, opened his thick file and immediately launched into his aggressive demands. He officially demanded the prompt transfer of the $1.5 million Virginia estate, the immediate handover of the $10 million security firm, and the release of all frozen banking accounts. Then Beatrice held up her hand, interrupting her own lawyer. She looked across the table at me, her eyes narrowing with pure greed. She wanted to inflict one final layer of humiliation. "I also want the keys to your vehicle," Beatrice demanded, pointing a manicured finger toward the parking lot outside. "My son purchased that sedan using an Apex Tactical corporate credit card. It is company property. I want you handing over the keys before you walk out of this building. You can call a taxi to take you back to whatever hole you crawled out of." Jonathan immediately slammed his hands on the table, playing his part perfectly. "That is completely absurd," Jonathan argued, his voice rising in manufactured anger. "That vehicle is her primary mode of transportation. You are attempting to strip my client of her basic livelihood." I reached out and placed a trembling hand on Jonathan's arm. I took a slow, deep breath, perfectly channeling the exhaustion and trauma I had genuinely experienced over the past week, but weaponizing it for this exact moment. I let my shoulders slump forward. I buried my face in my hands. I squeezed my eyes completely shut until real heavy tears spilled over my lashes and dropped onto the polished mahogany table. I let out a pathetic, broken sob that echoed through the quiet conference room. I lifted my head and looked directly at Beatrice, letting my voice shake with manufactured despair. "You win," I whispered, wiping my wet cheeks. "I cannot do this anymore. I cannot sleep. I cannot eat. I cannot afford to pay Jonathan for another month of endless court battles while my bank accounts are locked. I am entirely broken. If you want the house, take it. If you want David's company, take it. I will give you the bank accounts and I will leave my car keys on this table. I will give you absolutely everything." A bright, victorious gleam ignited in Beatrice's eyes. Caroline actually clapped her hands together in delight. "But I am not doing this on your terms," I continued, sniffing loudly and pulling a single document from Jonathan's briefcase. I pushed the crisp sheet of paper across the table toward Mr. Kensington. "I will surrender my spousal elective share and walk away with nothing," I said, keeping my voice fragile. "But you must sign an absolute assumption of estate right now. I want a completely clean break today. No 30-day financial reviews, no standard probate auditing, no legal delays. You must take the entire estate exactly as it is, effective immediately, and waive your right to ever pursue me for any future corporate discrepancies." Mr. Kensington picked up the document. His eyes scanned the legal phrasing, and his expression instantly darkened. He slammed his hand flat over the paper and turned sharply to Beatrice. "Do not sign this," Mr. Kensington warned, his professional tone replaced with urgent alarm. "Waiving a forensic probate audit on a corporate entity of this size is incredibly dangerous. Assuming an estate exactly as is means you legally absorb all hidden debts and undisclosed liabilities. We need to audit the company ledgers first." Terrence panicked. The color drained completely from his face. He knew exactly what a forensic audit would reveal. It would instantly expose his 3 years of meticulous embezzlement. It would expose the $4.2 million shadow loan he had illegally taken out against my house and the business. If Mr. Kensington audited those books, Terrence would go to federal prison and his loan sharks would tear him apart. Terrence lunged across the table and grabbed Beatrice's arm. "Ignore him," Terrence whispered frantically, loud enough for the entire room to hear. "Look at her, Beatrice. Jocelyn is just a broke, desperate accountant trying to dodge paying the final closing fees. If we agree to an audit, the judge will keep the company funds frozen for another 6 months. Caroline will not get her payout until next year. The business is solid. Just sign the paper and let us get rid of this gold digger today." Beatrice looked at my tear-stained, pathetic expression. Her colossal ego completely blinded her to her own lawyer's desperate legal warnings. She saw a defeated woman begging to be released from a fight she had clearly lost. Beatrice did not care about audits or liabilities. She only cared about crushing me beneath her designer heel and claiming her dead son's empire. Beatrice snatched the luxury fountain pen right out of Mr. Kensington's hand. She pulled the document toward her, completely ignoring her attorney's frantic protests, and prepared to sign her own financial death warrant. Beatrice held the heavy gold fountain pen suspended just an inch above the signature line. The air in the arbitration room grew thick and heavy. Terence was leaning so far forward he was practically hovering over the mahogany table, his eyes locked on the tip of the pen, like a starving man staring at a meal. But Beatrice did not sign. A slow, vicious smile curled the corners of her dark red lips. She placed the pen back down on the table. Her colossal ego was not entirely satisfied yet. She had my house, she had my husband's $10 million company, she had my car keys sitting next to the legal binder, but she wanted something far more valuable to a narcissist. She wanted my absolute total humiliation permanently entered into the public record. "I am not signing this document quite yet," Beatrice announced, leaning back in her plush leather chair. "I require one final addendum to this mediation agreement before I accept the estate." Mr. Kensington looked exhausted. "Beatrice, please. We have secured the assets. Let us finalize this." Beatrice held up her hand, silencing her highly paid attorney. She looked directly at me, her eyes gleaming with dark satisfaction. "I want a formal written apology added to the final decree," Beatrice demanded. "I want it stated on the official court record that you, Jocelyn, actively attempted to steal my family's generational wealth. I want you to formally admit that you manipulated my son during his final days, and I want you to apologize for disrespecting this family. If you do not sign that admission of guilt, I walk away from this table right now and we go to trial where I will bleed you dry." A heavy silence fell over the conference room. Jonathan immediately stood up his chair, scraping loudly against the hardwood floor. This was not part of the act. My attorney was genuinely appalled. "Absolutely not," Jonathan said, his voice hard and uncompromising. "That is not a legal stipulation. That is a character assassination completely irrelevant to the division of assets. My client will not sign a fabricated confession of elder abuse and financial theft just to satisfy your ego. We will go back to the judge." Terence let out a low, dark chuckle. He leaned back in his chair, folding his arms across his chest. He looked at me with absolute sickening triumph. He actually believed they had completely broken me. "Come on," Jocelyn, Terence taunted. "You said you wanted peace. You said you were tired. Do not let your lawyer drag this out for another 6 months just to protect your fragile pride. You lost. Just write the apology, sign the paper, and you can finally go back to your pathetic invisible life." Caroline chimed in, pulling out her phone to record my reaction. "Make sure she signs it in blue ink so we know it is original," Caroline sneered. "I want to frame it and hang it in David's old office. They were terrible, greedy people. But their sheer arrogance was exactly what I needed to cement the legal trap. They were so blinded by their desire to punish me that they completely ignored the fact that they were begging to swallow a financial hand grenade." I reached out and gently pulled Jonathan back down into his seat. I looked at him and shook my head slowly, playing the role of the thoroughly defeated widow one last time. "I will do it," I whispered, keeping my voice incredibly fragile and unsteady. "I will sign whatever she wants. Just write the addendum." Jonathan looked at me genuinely pained, but he opened his laptop and hastily drafted the humiliating paragraph. He printed the single page and slid it across the table. The words were vile. They painted me as a manipulative gold-digging fraud who had preyed on a vulnerable, decorated veteran. It was a complete desecration of the beautiful, honest marriage David and I had shared. But I knew David would forgive me for signing it because David knew exactly what I was doing to the people who had betrayed him. I picked up the pen. My hand trembled perfectly as I signed my name at the bottom of the apology. I pushed the paper across the table to Beatrice. Beatrice picked it up, reading my signature with a look of pure, euphoric ecstasy. Her ego had been stroked to the absolute maximum limit. She felt like an invincible queen reclaiming her throne. Without another word of protest, without listening to a single warning from Mr. Kensington about the dangers of waiving a financial audit, Beatrice confidently signed her name on the absolute assumption of a state document. The ink dried, the trap snapped shut. By signing that document, Beatrice officially, legally, and irreversibly assumed sole ownership of Apex Tactical. And by waiving the probate audit, she had just legally absorbed every single hidden liability, every shadow ledger, and every ounce of Terrence's $4.2 million fraudulent commercial debt. "We are done here," Mr. Kensington said sharply, gathering his files with tight, frustrated movements. "The mediator will submit this signed agreement to Judge Mitchell. The judge will issue the final ceremonial stamp tomorrow morning at 9. The estate is officially yours, Beatrice." Beatrice stood up, smoothing her expensive silk dress. She did not even look at me. She simply told Terrence to grab my car keys off the table. They walked out of the conference room, laughing, leaving me sitting in the silence. I waited exactly 2 minutes. I stood up, smoothed the wrinkles out of my cheap gray suit, and walked out of the arbitration firm. I stepped into the empty elevator and watched the stainless steel doors slide shut. The second the doors locked together, the trembling in my hands stopped entirely. The fake tears dried up. My posture straightened, and the fragile, broken widow vanished into thin air. I walked out into the concrete parking garage. Since Terrence had literally taken my car keys, I walked toward the street to catch a cab. As I stepped into the warm Virginia afternoon, I pulled a secure secondary cell phone from the inside pocket of my blazer. I dialed a direct, unlisted number I had memorized 2 days ago. It rang twice. Special Agent Reynolds, Internal Revenue Service. Criminal Investigation Division, a stern voice answered on the other end of the line. "This is the anonymous tipster regarding the Apex tactical tax evasion and wire fraud files I transmitted to your secure server yesterday," I said, my voice ringing with cold, metallic authority. "I am listening," the federal agent replied, his tone immediately shifting into high alert. "The target has officially acquired the corporate assets and assumed all financial liabilities on the public record," I informed him. "The probate transfer is complete. The principals are currently occupying the primary residential property where the server IP address was located," understood, the agent said. I looked down the street, watching the city traffic flow by. "Move in tomorrow at exactly 10 in the morning," I commanded. "Bring the federal marshals." I hung up the phone and hailed a taxi. Beatrice wanted me to write an apology for trying to steal her wealth. She did not realize she had just signed a confession for federal tax evasion. The city traffic blurred past the taxi window as I rode away from the arbitration firm. The air conditioning in the back seat hummed loudly, masking the sound of my racing heartbeat. I had just signed a humiliating, fabricated apology and completely surrendered my legal rights to a $10 million company and a luxury estate. To anyone else, I looked like a woman who had just thrown her entire life away. I pulled my primary cell phone from my purse and watched the screen light up. Terrence could not resist gloating. He had just watched me break down in fake tears and sign away the keys to the corporate bank accounts he desperately needed. He thought he had completely outsmarted me. A new text message from him glowed on my screen. "Thanks for the keys to the kingdom. Do not worry, we will buy you a coffee someday." I stared at the arrogant message. He was so blinded by his immediate victory that he had no idea he was celebrating on the deck of a sinking ship. Before I could even swipe the notification away, a second message popped up. This one was an image file sent directly from Caroline. I tapped the screen, and a high-resolution photograph loaded. Caroline was standing on the expansive stone patio of my backyard in Virginia. A massive fire was roaring in the custom stone fire pit David and I had built by hand. Caroline was actively tossing my remaining personal items into the open flames. I recognized my favorite winter scarf, a stack of my advanced accounting textbooks, and a framed photograph of my parents. She had even thrown in a few of David's favorite classic novels, showing absolutely zero respect for her own brother's memory. She had attached a cruel caption at the bottom of the image: "Clearing out the trash. Hope you enjoy waiting at the bus stop." They wanted me to feel utterly worthless. They were doing everything in their malicious power to break my spirit on the night before the judge made the estate transfer permanent. But looking at that photograph of the bonfire, All I felt was a profound sense of clinical, razor-sharp satisfaction. Caroline was burning my old textbooks while standing on top of a property that was about to be aggressively raided by federal agents. I paid the taxi driver in cash, walked up the narrow stairs to my temporary bare-bones apartment, and locked the deadbolt behind me. I did not turn on the television. I did not pour a glass of wine to soothe my nerves. I sat down at the small wooden desk in the corner of the room, opened my laptop, and got to work. I am a forensic accountant. I do not rely on luck and I do not rely on emotion. I rely on immaculate, indisputable documentation. I pulled 3 heavy, empty manila folders from my desk drawer and laid them out in a perfectly straight line across the wooden surface. I connected my portable printer and began processing the documents I had extracted from the underground server. The first folder was labeled IRS, Criminal Investigation Division. Into this thick folder, I placed the offshore routing numbers, the shadow ledgers, and the concrete proof of 3 years of deliberate corporate tax evasion orchestrated entirely by Terrence. The second folder was labeled Federal Bureau of Investigation. This folder received the blatantly fraudulent commercial loan applications, the forged corporate signatures Terrence used to leverage the marital home, and the heavily documented communication logs between him and the underground private lenders. The third folder was reserved for Judge Mitchell. I printed a comprehensive financial summary proving that the estate Beatrice had just aggressively assumed was not a $10 million asset. It was a massive, highly toxic financial liability, drowning in $4.2 million of defaulted debt. As I neatly aligned the edges of the paper and clipped them into the folders, my mind wandered back to David. When David first discovered the massive discrepancies in the company accounts shortly before his death, it had broken his heart. He had trusted his family to manage the finances while he focused on the security operations. But David was a military tactician at his core. When he realized his brother-in-law was bleeding his legacy dry and that his mother and sister were willingly turning a blind eye to the sudden influx of cash, he did not panic. He sat down with me at our kitchen table late one night. He told me that a good commander never fights a battle on the enemy's chosen terrain. You let them take the compromised ground and you secure your actual valuable assets behind heavily fortified lines. Terrence and Beatrice were so obsessed with the glamorous title of owning Apex Tactical and the physical prestige of the Virginia mansion that they never bothered to look at how David had structured his personal wealth. They arrogantly assumed the security company was his only source of income. I closed the 3 manila folders and opened a completely different, highly secure web portal on my laptop. I entered a 32-character encrypted password and scanned my fingerprint. The screen loaded a private banking dashboard. In the United States legal system, certain financial accounts are classified as non-probate assets. They do not go through the court system. They cannot be frozen by an emergency ex parte order. They are not subjected to estate taxes, and they are absolutely invisible to creditors and greedy family members. These specific assets transfer instantly and directly to the named beneficiary the moment a death certificate is issued. David possessed a maximum-tier service members group life insurance policy from his decades of combat deployments. Combined with a private irrevocable financial trust we had quietly established 3 years ago, these funds were completely insulated from the toxic corporate fallout of Apex Tactical. The web page refreshed. The bold black numbers appeared on the glowing screen. $6.5 million. It was sitting in a completely untouched tax-free cash account solely under my name. It was legally bulletproof. Terrence's ruthless loan sharks could not touch it. The Internal Revenue Service could not freeze it, and Beatrice could not claim a single penny of it. I looked at the 3 heavy folders sitting on my desk, locked and loaded for tomorrow morning. Then I looked at the $6.5 million resting safely in my account. I closed the laptop. My husband had protected me perfectly. Tomorrow at 9 in the morning, the judge was going to permanently stamp the mediation agreement. Tomorrow, Beatrice was going to officially crown herself the queen of a poisoned empire. I turned off the desk lamp, and finally, for the first time since David passed away, I got a full night of peaceful sleep. The morning of the final probate hearing arrived with a crisp, clear blue sky over Virginia. I walked up the wide concrete steps of the county courthouse with my attorney Jonathan right by my side. His heavy leather briefcase contained the signed mediation agreement from yesterday, along with the 3 meticulously organized folders I had prepared the night before. I checked my watch. It was exactly 8:45 in the morning. In exactly 1 hour and 15 minutes, a team of federal agents would be kicking down the front door of the estate my mother-in-law was about to claim. We walked into the courtroom and took our seats at the petitioner table. I wore the same simple, inexpensive gray suit I had worn to the preliminary hearing. I wore no jewelry, pulled my hair back into a tight bun, and kept my posture completely subdued. 10 minutes later, the heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom swung open. Beatrice, Caroline, and Terence made their grand entrance. They did not walk into the legal proceeding like a family mourning the recent loss of a decorated military veteran. They walked down the center aisle like they were stepping onto a red carpet at a Hollywood premiere. Beatrice wore a custom-tailored emerald green silk dress paired with a massive pearl necklace. She held her chin incredibly high, treating the somber courtroom like it was her own personal coronation ceremony. Caroline walked right behind her, aggressively flaunting a pair of diamond drop earrings that I knew for a fact she had purchased using the Apex Tactical corporate credit card just 2 days ago. But it was Terence who looked the most transformed. The frantic, sweating, terrified man I had faced in the mediation room was completely gone. He strutted into the courtroom, wearing a brand new charcoal suit and a custom silk tie. He casually checked his expensive watch, a relaxed, arrogant smile plastered across his face. He believed he had successfully beaten the clock. He thought the corporate accounts would be unfrozen in a matter of minutes, giving him full access to the cash he desperately needed to pay off his violent private lenders. They took their seats at the defense table. Beatrice did not even bother to look in my direction. She was entirely focused on the judge's empty bench, practically vibrating with greedy anticipation. A moment later, the bailiff announced Judge Mitchell. The older, stern-faced judge took his seat at the high wooden bench, adjusted his reading glasses, and called the hearing to order. Mr. Kensington, Beatrice's high-priced estate lawyer, immediately sprang to his feet. He grabbed the thick legal binder containing the mediation agreement and marched confidently to the center of the courtroom. He puffed out his chest, ready to deliver a theatrical performance for the court record. Your Honor. Mr. Kensington began, his voice echoing loudly off the wood-paneled walls. I am incredibly pleased to announce that the parties have reached a full binding and absolute resolution during our mandatory mediation. We are presenting the finalized agreement for your official seal today. Mr. Kensington paused, turning slightly so he could gesture dramatically toward Beatrice. By signing this agreement, the petitioner has rightfully withdrawn all claims to the marital assets. My clients are stepping forward today to preserve the heroic legacy of a decorated military commander. They intervened to protect a $10 million company and a generational family home from falling into the hands of an opportunistic outsider. We are asking the court to stamp this transfer immediately so the true family can restore order to this prestigious estate. It was a repulsive, highly offensive speech, but sitting at my table I did not react. I did not glare at him. I did not shake my head in protest. I simply sat with my hands folded in my lap, looking down at the wooden table. The contrast in the room was deafening. Beatrice was dripping in expensive jewelry, sitting with arrogant, terrible pride. Caroline was smirking openly. Mr. Kensington was boasting loudly about wealth and status. And across the aisle I sat in my cheap gray suit, completely silent and entirely alone. The court staff, the bailiffs, and the few public observers sitting in the gallery all looked at Beatrice with clear, undeniable distaste. Without saying a single word, my quiet, restrained demeanor highlighted their vile greed for the entire room to see. Judge Mitchell accepted the heavy binder from Mr. Kensington. The courtroom fell silent as the judge began reading through the finalized mediation documents. He turned the pages slowly, his eyes scanning the dense legal paragraphs. I watched his expression carefully. When Judge Mitchell reached the section detailing the absolute assumption of estate, his reading glasses slipped slightly down his nose. He stopped reading. He furrowed his brow, his eyes darting back to reread a specific paragraph. He had found the trap. He had noticed the highly unusual clause where Beatrice explicitly waived all rights to a standard probate audit. Judge Mitchell slowly closed the heavy binder. He folded his hands on the bench and looked down directly at me. His stern face was filled with genuine fatherly concern. He saw a young widow making a catastrophic financial mistake, and he wanted to give me one last chance to save myself. Mrs. Jocelyn, Judge Mitchell said, his deep voice cutting through the silent courtroom. I have reviewed this agreement. You are signing a document that waives your right to a forensic financial review. You are completely walking away from a highly lucrative corporate entity and a significant piece of residential real estate. I need to ask you this for the official court record. The judge leaned forward, his eyes locking onto mine. Are you absolutely certain you are of sound mind surrendering this multi-million-dollar estate? Terrence stopped smiling. Beatrice gripped the edge of her table, terrified that the judge was going to ruin her victory at the very last second. I stood up slowly. I smoothed the front of my gray jacket. I looked up at Judge Mitchell, dropping the act of the fragile, broken widow entirely. My voice did not shake. It rang out across the courtroom with crystal-clear, absolute conviction. I have never been more certain of anything in my life, Your Honor. The echo of my voice faded into the high ceilings of the courtroom. Judge Mitchell stared at me for a long, heavy moment. He was searching my eyes for any sign of hesitation, any flicker of doubt or coercion. Finding absolutely none, he let out a slow, defeated sigh. He nodded his head, resigning himself to the fact that he could not legally force me to protect my own financial interests if I was determined to surrender them. Beatrice did not wait for a formal invitation from the bench. She practically floated out of her chair, her emerald green silk dress rustling loudly in the quiet room. She stepped up to the massive wooden bench with the rigid posture of a conquering queen, claiming her long-awaited spoils. She reached out and snatched the heavy gold pen from the hands of her attorney, Mr. Kensington. Before putting the ink to the paper, Beatrice turned her head slowly. She looked right past her highly paid lawyer and locked her cold, dark eyes entirely on me. It was a look of pure, venomous victory. She wanted to make sure I was watching the exact second she erased me from her family history and stripped me of my husband's legacy. Behind her, seated at the defense table, Terrence could not sit still. He was practically vibrating with adrenaline and sheer relief. He had his phone hidden just below the edge of the heavy wooden table, his thumbs flying across the glowing screen. I knew exactly what he was doing. He was furiously texting the violent private lenders I had photographed him meeting with days earlier. He was promising them that the massive corporate accounts were finally unlocked, guaranteeing that their illicit $4.2 million payout would be wired by the end of the business day. His breathing was rapid, the sweat on his forehead drying now that he believed his life was no longer in physical danger. Sitting next to him, Caroline leaned over and whispered loudly to Mr. Kensington's paralegal. She did not care who heard her. She boasted that she had already scheduled 3 different luxury contractors to walk through my house tomorrow morning. She bragged about tearing down the walls David and I had built by hand, replacing the hardwood floors, and completely gutting the master bathroom to rid the prestigious estate of my cheap working-class stench. Her absolute arrogance filled the space between us. Beatrice lowered her hand. She signed her name with aggressive sweeping strokes on the final page of the mediation agreement. She signed her name on the absolute assumption of estate document. She signed her name on the specific waiver that explicitly bypassed a standard forensic probate audit. She handed the gold pen back to her attorney with a deeply satisfied, arrogant smirk. Mr. Kensington gathered the paperwork, aligned the edges perfectly, and handed the heavy stack of documents up to the bench. Judge Mitchell took the file with a grim expression. He reviewed Beatrice's signatures one last time to ensure every legal requirement was met. He picked up his heavy brass official court seal. He pressed it down firmly onto the front page. The sharp mechanical thud of the stamp echoed through the silent courtroom like a gunshot. It was officially over. The legal transfer was absolutely binding and irreversible. Beatrice was now the sole undisputed owner of Apex Tactical. She was the sole owner of the $1.5 million Virginia estate. She owned the corporate vehicles, the business credit cards, and the entire legacy of her decorated military son. She had taken everything she set out to take, leaving me with nothing but the cheap gray suit on my back. Beatrice turned away from the bench. She smoothed the front of her expensive dress and took a victorious step back toward her children. Terence let out a loud, highly inappropriate sigh of relief, sinking back into his chair. Caroline clapped her hands together quietly, her diamond earrings catching the light. They were ready to walk out of those heavy oak doors and celebrate their massive fortune. They did not make it past the wooden partition. I placed my hand flat on the petitioner table. That was the silent signal we had agreed upon. Beside me, my attorney Jonathan stood up smoothly. His wooden chair scraped loudly against the floor, instantly drawing the attention of the entire courtroom. Jonathan reached into his thin leather briefcase. He pulled out the heavy, meticulously organized manila folder I had printed and compiled in the dark hours of the early morning. "Excuse me, Your Honor," Jonathan said, his voice completely stripped away the timid, defeated tone he had used just moments before. It rang out across the room with sharp, uncompromising professional authority. "Before the court adjourns, we have one final mandatory submission for the public record." Judge Mitchell looked up, his brow furrowed in genuine confusion. "Counselor, the estate transfer has already been finalized and stamped. Your client has surrendered her claims. The matter is closed. What else could you possibly need to submit?" Jonathan stepped out from behind our table. He walked straight toward the center aisle, holding the thick manila folder out in front of him. "Your Honor, since the absolute assumption of estate has officially been signed and legally assumed by the opposing party, my client is no longer bound by corporate confidentiality regarding the internal finances of Apex Tactical," Jonathan announced clearly. "Furthermore, as my client is a federally licensed forensic accountant, she has a strict, non-negotiable fiduciary duty to the court to submit this addendum of liabilities directly to the new legal owner." The bailiff stepped forward, his heavy boots echoing on the hardwood floor. He took the thick manila folder from Jonathan's outstretched hand and carried it up to the high wooden bench. Judge Mitchell accepted the file with a deep frown of mild irritation. He had already stamped the final decree. As far as he was concerned, the case was closed. He flipped open the cardboard cover, fully expecting to see some minor administrative tax forms or a standard final payroll ledger. Instead, he saw the smoking gun. I remained standing at the petitioner table, my hands resting calmly at my sides. I watched the exact second the judge's eyes hit the first page. It was a brightly colored alert from the Criminal Investigation Division of the Internal Revenue Service confirming receipt of a massive data packet containing evidence of corporate tax evasion. Judge Mitchell adjusted his reading glasses. He turned to the second page. His frown deepened into a harsh, rigid line. This page contained the highly illegal forged commercial loan applications Terence had submitted to shady private lenders, actively using my home and Apex Tactical as collateral. The judge turned to the third page. His eyes widened. He was looking at the shadow ledgers I had pulled from the underground server. The raw data showed exactly how much money had been aggressively siphoned out of the company over the last 36 months. The courtroom was suffocatingly quiet. The only sound was the sharp rustle of heavy paper as Judge Mitchell flipped through the devastating financial evidence. He read for 3 full minutes. At the defense table, the arrogance was slowly beginning to crack. Beatrice shifted uncomfortably in her chair, her emerald green silk dress suddenly looking overly stiff and restrictive. She shot a frustrated, questioning look at her high-priced attorney. Mr. Kensington simply shook his head, looking just as confused as his client. But Terence was completely unraveling. The relaxed, confident commercial real estate developer who had strutted into the courtroom 30 minutes ago was completely gone. His hands gripped the edge of the wooden table. His breath grew shallow and rapid. He stared at the manila folder in the judge's hands with wide, terrified eyes. He knew exactly what a forensic accountant did for a living, and the horrifying reality of what I might have just handed to a federal judge was finally dawning on him. Judge Mitchell slowly closed the thick folder. He pressed his palms flat against the top of the file, completely covering it. He took off his reading glasses and let out a long, heavy breath. The judge did not look at me. He looked directly at the defense table. His gaze bypassed Terrence and Caroline, entirely locking squarely onto Beatrice and her attorney. Counselor Judge Mitchell said, his deep voice slicing through the tense silence like a razor blade. Have you explained to your client the full legal ramifications of the document she just aggressively demanded to sign? Mr. Kensington stood up, his professional confidence wavering for the very first time. Your Honor, my client signed an absolute assumption of estate. She has assumed full ownership of all assets associated with Apex Tactical and the residential property. Judge Mitchell shook his head, his expression turning dangerously cold. That is exactly right, Counselor, the judge replied. Your client waived her right to a standard probate audit. She explicitly demanded to take this corporate entity entirely as is. So I need to ask you a very direct question. Have you explained to Beatrice that by assuming sole absolute ownership of Apex Tactical today, she has just legally accepted personal non-dischargeable liability for $4.2 million in defaulted fraudulent commercial loans? The air was completely sucked out of the room. The court reporter literally stopped typing. The bailiff stood up straighter. Beatrice froze. The victorious, condescending smile she had worn since the moment she walked through the doors shattered into a million pieces. The color completely drained from her face, leaving her looking sickly and pale. $4.2 million. Beatrice repeated, her voice nothing but a hollow, breathless whisper. Judge Mitchell was not finished. And is your client aware? The judge continued, raising his voice so it echoed off the back walls, that by officially stamping her name as the sole legal proprietor of this business, she is now the primary target of an active Internal Revenue Service criminal tax evasion probe. Federal agents are currently moving to seize all company assets to cover massive discrepancies in offshore wire transfers. A loud collective gasp went up from the gallery. Mr. Kensington dropped his expensive pen. It clattered loudly against the floor. He looked at Beatrice with sheer, unadulterated panic. By aggressively pushing to bypass the audit to save time, he had just legally bound his wealthy client to a catastrophic, prison-worthy financial disaster. Terrence could no longer contain himself. The illusion of his success was burning to the ground right in front of his eyes. He jumped up from his chair so fast it tipped backward and crashed against the floor. Objection! Terrence yelled at the top of his lungs, completely ignoring the fact that he was not a lawyer and had absolutely no right to speak. That is a lie. That is a fabricated lie. Apex Tactical is a gold mine. The company has $10 million in verified liquid assets. It was the moment I had waited for since the second Beatrice threw that outdated will onto my kitchen counter. It was the moment I had worked for while sitting in my freezing car, while enduring Caroline's vile social media videos, and while smiling at Terrence in the parking lot. I finally stood up. I did not slouch. I did not shake. I stood perfectly straight, smoothing the front of my cheap gray suit. I looked across the aisle at the man who had tried to leave my mother homeless on the street. It did have $10 million, I said, my voice ringing out with icy, undeniable authority. Before you, Terrence embezzled it into offshore shell companies over the last 3 years. The words hit the courtroom like a physical shockwave. For a split second, nobody moved. The silence was so profound I could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning vents above us. Then the reality of my statement crashed down on the defense table. Beatrice slowly turned her head toward her son-in-law. The arrogant, triumphant posture she had maintained all morning completely collapsed. Her jaw trembled. The color had fully drained from her face, leaving her looking hollow and terrified. She looked at Terrence, a man she had always praised for his supposed commercial real estate acumen, and finally saw him for the desperate, fraudulent thief he truly was. "What did you do?" Beatrice whispered, her voice cracking under the weight of her realization. Terrence could not even look her in the eye. He was hyperventilating, his chest heaving under his expensive, custom-tailored suit. "What did you do to my company?" Beatrice screamed at the top of her lungs, completely losing her aristocratic high society composure. "You told me the business was a gold mine. You told me we were incredibly rich." Terrence did not answer her. Pure survival instinct kicked in, overriding any shred of family loyalty he pretended to possess. He shoved his chair backwards so violently it toppled over and crashed against the wooden railing. He turned away from the judge, away from his screaming mother-in-law, and bolted straight down the center aisle toward the heavy oak double doors at the back of the courtroom. He was going to make a run for his brand-new Porsche and try to flee the state before the federal agents could catch up to his offshore wire transfers. He did not even make it halfway down the aisle. Two armed court bailiffs stepped directly into his path, their hands resting firmly on their utility belts. They blocked the heavy wooden doors with their bodies, completely cutting off his only avenue of escape. Terrence skidded to a halt, looking wildly around the room like a trapped animal, realizing the cage had just snapped shut. "Sit back down, sir," one of the bailiffs commanded, his voice echoing with absolute authority. "You are not leaving this room." Judge Mitchell banged his heavy wooden gavel against the sounding block, demanding immediate order in his courtroom. The sharp, cracking noise forced everyone to freeze. "Return to the defense table immediately," Judge Mitchell ordered, pointing a stern finger at Terrence. "You are not going anywhere." Early this morning, my chambers received an emergency federal injunction directly from the Criminal Investigation Division of the Internal Revenue Service. They requested that this court detain any individuals associated with the financial management of Apex Tactical the exact moment the probate transfer was finalized. I have been informed that federal agents are currently securing the primary residential estate in Virginia and seizing all corporate servers. Terrence's knees buckled. He stumbled backward and fell heavily into his chair. He buried his face in his hands, realizing he was not just broke. He was going to federal prison. At the defense table, pure, unadulterated panic took over. Mr. Kensington, Beatrice's high-priced attorney, realized he had just guided his wealthy client into a catastrophic legal nightmare. His malpractice liability was suddenly through the roof. He scrambled to his feet, waving his hands frantically at the bench. "Your Honor, we withdraw!" Mr. Kensington yelled, his professional composure entirely shattered. "We request an immediate retraction of the mediation agreement." My client was completely unaware of these hidden debts and federal investigations. She was deliberately deceived by her son-in-law. We motion to nullify the signature based on egregious financial fraud. Judge Mitchell glared down at the panicked attorney. He did not reach for his pen. He did not offer an ounce of sympathy. Absolutely not. Counselor Judge Mitchell declared, his voice ringing with absolute finality. "I warned you. I looked your client in the eye and asked her if she was certain. I explicitly warned her about waiving her right to a standard forensic audit. But your client was so incredibly eager to take everything from a grieving widow that she demanded to sign an absolute assumption of estate." The judge leaned forward, delivering the final crushing blow. She signed it. She waived the audit. She demanded to take the company exactly as it is today. And as it is today, Apex Tactical is $4.2 million in debt and the target of a massive federal criminal probe. I have officially stamped the decree. The debt is entirely hers. I suggest you focus your efforts on finding your client a very good federal defense attorney. Beatrice let out a strangled, breathless gasp. She gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles turning white. She had wanted to steal my husband's legacy, and instead she had legally chained herself to a sinking ship loaded with federal crimes. She was going to lose her own personal wealth, her social standing, and quite possibly her freedom, all to pay for Terrence's massive commercial embezzlement. Beside her, Caroline was hyperventilating. The reality of their total financial ruin was crashing down on her spoiled, entitled worldview. She had spent the last 24 hours bragging on social media about inheriting millions. She had mocked me, tried to evict my mother, and worn my dead husband's military uniform as a joke. Now she was married to a federally indicted felon, and her mother was millions of dollars in debt. Caroline spun around to face me. Her eyes were wild, filled with a frantic, desperate hatred. She pointed a shaking finger across the aisle. "You planned this!" Caroline screamed, her voice echoing shrilly across the quiet courtroom. "You set us up! You knew exactly what Terrence was doing, and you tricked us into taking the fall." I stood calmly at my table. I did not raise my voice. I did not flinch. I simply looked at her. Caroline let out a hysterical, bitter laugh, trying desperately to find a single shred of victory in the ashes of her life. She gripped the edge of her table and glared at me with pure venom. "Well, you played yourself, Jocelyn," Caroline yelled, pointing a manicured finger at my cheap gray suit. "You might have handed us the debt, but you gave up your spousal rights to do it. You are leaving us with nothing, but you have nothing either. You gave up the house. You gave up the bank accounts. You are still a broke, unemployed loser who has to sleep in her car. You lost everything too." Caroline's laughter bounced off the high vaulted ceilings of the courtroom. It was a manic, hysterical sound. She was desperately clinging to the very last shred of comfort she could find in the absolute wreckage of her life. Her husband was about to be indicted for massive federal tax evasion. Her mother had just legally assumed $4.2 million in fraudulent commercial debt. But in Caroline's spoiled, deeply entitled mind, none of that mattered as long as she could believe I was suffering right alongside them. She pointed a shaking finger at my cheap gray suit. She mocked the fact that I had handed over the keys to the Virginia estate and the company vehicles. She reveled in the idea that I had supposedly negotiated myself into total utter poverty just to stick them with a failing business. She called me a broke, unemployed loser who had absolutely nothing left to her name. I let her finish. I stood perfectly still and allowed her to empty every last ounce of venom she had left in her lungs. When Caroline finally ran out of breath, her chest heaving as she glared at me across the aisle, I did not yell back. I did not match her frantic, desperate energy. Instead, I slowly reached down and unclasped my attorney's thin leather briefcase. I reached inside and pulled out a single crisp sheet of white paper. I straightened the lapels of my jacket. I walked out from behind the petitioner table and took 3 slow, deliberate steps toward the center aisle. "Actually, Caroline," I said, my voice cutting through the thick tension in the room with icy, absolute precision. "You and your mother were so incredibly blinded by your own greed that you made a catastrophic financial miscalculation. You were so obsessed with stealing the glamorous title of owning a private security firm and showing off a luxury mansion to your country club friends that you never bothered to look at how my husband actually structured his personal wealth." Caroline stopped smiling. She looked down at the single sheet of paper in my hand, a sudden creeping dread washing over her face. In the United States legal system, I continued speaking clearly, so every single person in the gallery could hear my impromptu lesson in forensic accounting. There are certain financial accounts classified as non-probate assets. These specific assets do not go through the court system. They cannot be frozen by an emergency ex parte order, no matter how many corrupt judges Terrence tries to bribe. They bypass the estate entirely. They transfer automatically and instantly to the named beneficiary the very second a death certificate is issued. I took another step forward and held the piece of paper out toward her. Caroline hesitated, her hands trembling before she finally snatched the document from my grip. David was a highly decorated military commander with decades of combat deployments, I explained, watching her eyes scan the bold black numbers printed on the page. He possessed a maximum-tier service members group life insurance policy. Combined with a private, irrevocable financial trust we quietly established 3 years ago, his actual legacy was completely insulated from the toxic corporate fallout of Apex Tactical. Caroline let out a soft, choked gasp. The paper shook violently in her hands. "David left me $6.5 million in untouchable tax-free cash," I announced. The words echoed like a final devastating death knell for the defense table. "It is currently sitting in a highly secure private account solely under my name. It is legally bulletproof. It is completely immune to Terrence's violent private lenders. It is immune to the Internal Revenue Service agents currently raiding your house. And most importantly, Caroline, it is utterly immune to you." The color drained completely from Caroline's face. She dropped the piece of paper. It fluttered to the hardwood floor, landing right next to her designer shoes. She had just realized the horrifying truth. I had not given up everything. I had intentionally surrendered a burning, sinking ship while safely flying away in a luxury helicopter. I was a multimillionaire, and she was entirely destitute. Behind her, Beatrice let out a sound that I had never heard before. It was a strangled, high-pitched wheeze that sounded like all the oxygen had been violently sucked out of her lungs. Beatrice had spent her entire life stepping on working-class people. She had canceled my wedding caterer to prove she had financial dominance. She had tried to throw my elderly mother out onto the street. She had demanded I write a humiliating apology letter just to stroke her own colossal ego. And now she had to face the reality that a simple forensic accountant had just orchestrated her complete and total financial execution. The shock was too much for her arrogant, fragile heart to handle. Beatrice clutched the fabric of her emerald green silk dress, her eyes rolling back into her head. She collapsed backward, her chair tipping over, and her body hit the courtroom floor with a heavy, sickening thud. She had literally fainted from the sheer magnitude of her own ruin. Absolute chaos erupted in the courtroom. Mr. Kensington began screaming for somebody to call 911. Caroline dropped to her knees beside her unconscious mother, wailing hysterically. The court bailiffs rushed forward, pulling out their radios to summon emergency paramedics to the scene. The gallery was in a complete uproar, people standing up to get a better look at the wealthy matriarch crumpled on the ground. But the swift, brutal hand of justice was not finished dispensing its punishment. While the medical emergency unfolded around Beatrice, the heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom slammed open. Two men wearing tactical vests and windbreakers with bright yellow lettering stepped into the room. They were special agents with the federal government acting on the emergency injunction Judge Mitchell had received that very morning. They did not care about the fainting woman on the floor. They walked straight past the frantic defense attorney and marched directly toward the defense table. Terence tried to back away, but his path was completely blocked by the wooden partition. He raised his hands in a pathetic gesture of surrender. Terence, one of the federal agents, announced, his voice booming with absolute authority. "You are under arrest for massive commercial wire fraud, deliberate corporate tax evasion, and the embezzlement of company funds. We have a federal warrant for your immediate detainment." The agent grabbed Terence by the arm, spinning him around and slamming him hard against the heavy wooden table. The sharp metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs ratcheting shut echoed clearly over Caroline's hysterical sobbing. Terence, the slick, arrogant commercial real estate developer who had tossed a $50 bill at my feet just days earlier, was roughly hauled away in chains. I stood quietly at my table watching the paramedics rush through the doors with a stretcher for Beatrice. I watched the federal marshals drag Terence out of the room in handcuffs. I watched Caroline completely break down, surrounded by the ashes of the fake empire she had tried to steal. I felt no pity. I felt no guilt. I simply picked up my purse, turned my back on the burning wreckage of their lives, and walked out of the courtroom a free, incredibly wealthy woman. 2 days had passed since the absolute explosion inside the probate courtroom. I sat at a secluded corner booth inside the most exclusive high-end steakhouse in downtown Richmond. The lighting was low and sophisticated soft jazz played from hidden speakers, and the crystal water glasses gleamed under the warm chandelier light. For the first time in an exceptionally long and painful week, the heavy knot of tension in my shoulders was completely gone. I ordered a perfectly cooked ribeye steak and a glass of their most expensive red wine. I was quietly celebrating the undeniable, undisputed power of meticulous forensic accounting. Across town, Caroline was experiencing a very different kind of reality. The federal government moves with terrifying, unstoppable speed when presented with an airtight tax evasion and wire fraud file. Because Terence had illegally used the Virginia marital home as collateral for his fraudulent commercial loans, the bank had immediately triggered the default clause. The very moment Beatrice signed the absolute assumption of estate inside the courtroom, she legally absorbed that toxic, crushing debt. Because my mother-in-law obviously could not produce $4.2 million in cash to satisfy the immediate demand, the bank aggressively foreclosed on the Virginia mansion. Federal agents had arrived with the bank representatives and physically padlocked the doors. Caroline was quite literally locked out of the luxury estate she had been bragging about remodeling just 48 hours ago. I was halfway through my steak when a frantic, disheveled figure burst through the heavy glass entry doors of the restaurant. It was Caroline, the arrogant, untouchable golden child who had openly mocked my cheap gray suit and worn my dead husband's military jacket as a comedy prop, was entirely unrecognizable. She looked like a woman who had just walked through a hurricane. Her expensive designer makeup was heavily smeared down her pale cheeks. Her hair was a tangled, unkempt mess. She wore the exact same sequined party dress she had worn in the courtroom, but now it looked cheap and wrinkled. She looked exactly like a person who had just realized she was completely destitute. She spotted me sitting in the corner booth and practically sprinted across the upscale dining room, ignoring the shocked, judgmental stares of the wealthy patrons. She threw herself into the leather chair across from me, sobbing hysterically. Her hands shook violently as she gripped the edge of the mahogany table. She begged me to help her. Through a series of heavy, frantic gasps, Caroline revealed the horrific details of their sudden, catastrophic downfall. Terrence was currently sitting in a federal holding cell. The magistrate judge had completely denied him bail because he was considered a severe flight risk due to his offshore shell accounts. The violent underground loan sharks he owed money to were currently circling his failing commercial real estate firm, tearing apart whatever physical assets he had left. Beatrice was still lying in a hospital bed, physically recovering from her dramatic courtroom collapse. However, she was now facing immediate personal bankruptcy and looming federal prison time for officially assuming the fraudulent enterprise. The stress was destroying her arrogant heart. Caroline wept openly, her tears splashing directly onto the pristine white tablecloth. She pleaded with me to access the $6.5 million I had legally secured in the private trust. She told me her credit cards were bouncing everywhere she went. She claimed she had nowhere safe to sleep tonight. She desperately tried to play the family card, begging me to save them from the federal prosecutors because David would have wanted his sister to be safe. I did not raise my voice. I did not call the restaurant security guards to have her removed from the premises. I simply picked up my heavy silver knife and fork and carefully cut another piece of my steak. I chewed it slowly, swallowed, and took a leisurely sip of my red wine. I looked across the table at the woman who had snatched my husband's Purple Heart medal right out of my hands. "Caroline," I said, my voice perfectly calm and entirely devoid of any sympathy. "Remember when you stood in my living room and told me I only married David for his military pension? Remember when you accused me of being a gold-digging parasite who never belonged in your elite high society world?" Caroline choked on a loud sob, desperately shaking her head back and forth, trying to frantically apologize for her vile behavior. I held up my hand, stopping her frantic apologies instantly. "You were wrong, Caroline. I married David because I loved him. I loved him more than anything in this world, but I am keeping his money to make sure you and your mother never hurt anyone ever again." The absolute freezing finality in my voice shattered the very last bit of hope Caroline was clinging to. She looked into my eyes and finally realized the brutal truth. I was not going to write her a check. I was not going to bail Terrence out of federal custody. I was going to sit back and let them burn in the financial fire they had deliberately set themselves. I signaled the waiter and paid for my meal in cash, leaving a highly generous tip. I stood up, smoothed the front of my blazer, and picked up my purse. I looked down at Caroline, who was now openly weeping into her hands, completely broken by her own unbridled greed. I reached into the front pocket of my jacket. I pulled out a single, crisp piece of paper money. It was the exact same $50 bill Terrence had arrogantly thrown at my feet in the accounting firm parking lot just days earlier. I dropped the $50 bill right onto the white tablecloth in front of her. "Take an Uber," I told Caroline, my voice echoing with pure, icy detachment. "I hear the bus schedule is very tricky this time of night." 3 weeks drifted by with the quiet, steady rhythm of absolute peace. I spent my mornings drinking coffee on the balcony of my new, highly secure downtown penthouse, watching the city wake up. But the city was not quiet about my former family. The local and national news networks were having an absolute feeding frenzy. Terrence was officially denied bail for a second time. The federal prosecutors unsealed the massive indictment against him, revealing a staggering, highly complex web of wire fraud, tax evasion, and offshore embezzlement that spanned nearly a decade. The local broadcast showed high-definition footage of federal agents hauling heavy cardboard boxes of financial documents out of his commercial real estate office. Then came the footage of the Virginia estate. The bank had aggressively moved to liquidate the property to satisfy the defaulted commercial loan. Beatrice was filmed walking out of the federal courthouse after her initial arraignment. She held a designer handbag over her face to block the flashing cameras and the shouting reporters. Her high society friends, the wealthy elite women she had spent decades trying to impress, completely turned their backs on her. She was a social pariah permanently blacklisted from every country club and charity gala in the state. Because she had arrogantly signed the assumption of estate, she was now facing total personal bankruptcy and a very real, very lengthy federal prison sentence. My professional vindication arrived on a Tuesday morning. My phone rang with a call from a number I recognized instantly. It was Mr. Bradley, the managing partner of the elite forensic accounting firm that had aggressively placed me on unpaid leave. I answered the call, my tone perfectly polite and entirely detached. Mr. Bradley sounded incredibly nervous. He spent the first 5 minutes of the conversation profusely apologizing for the firm's hasty decision. He told me that Caroline's ridiculous social media video had been entirely scrubbed from the internet, completely overshadowed by the massive federal raid on her husband. The narrative in the financial sector had violently flipped. In the elite corporate circles of the city, I was no longer seen as a disgraced manipulative widow. I was being universally hailed as a tactical financial genius. I had single-handedly orchestrated the downfall of a massive commercial fraud ring and completely insulated myself from the catastrophic blast radius. Mr. Bradley practically begged me to return to the firm. He offered me an immediate, highly lucrative promotion to a partner track position. He promised me my own corner office and a massive salary increase. He sounded desperate, admitting that their top corporate clients were now specifically requesting my services to audit their portfolios. I let him finish his frantic pitch. I took a slow sip of my coffee and looked out over the sprawling city skyline. I thanked him for the generous offer, keeping my voice perfectly level and professional. Then I told him I would be declining the position. Mr. Bradley was stunned into a heavy silence. He asked what competing firm had poached me, offering to beat whatever astronomical salary they had proposed. I smiled softly to myself. I told him I was not working for anyone else ever again. With the $6.5 million David had secured for me in the untouchable private trust, I had the capital to write my own rules. I informed Mr. Bradley that I was officially opening my own forensic accounting firm. My practice would not cater to massive, faceless corporations looking to hide their wealth. My firm was going to be specifically dedicated to helping vulnerable individuals. I was building an agency designed to help widows, retired veterans, and working-class families track down hidden assets and fight back against aggressive, greedy relatives and corporate fraud. I told him I already had a waiting list of clients who needed a protector who knew exactly how ruthless, greedy families could be. I wished him the best of luck and ended the call. Later that afternoon, the autumn air was crisp and cool. I drove out to the National Military Cemetery, where David was laid to rest. I walked down the long, perfectly manicured rows of pristine white marble headstones. The heavy, suffocating weight that had been pressing down on my chest since the day he died was finally gone. I stopped in front of his marker. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out a heavy brass military medal attached to a purple ribbon. I had used a swift federal court petition to legally retrieve David's Purple Heart from the seized property inventory just hours before the bank auctioned off the contents of the Virginia estate. Caroline had tried to steal it, but the law had brought it right back to my hands. I knelt down on the soft green grass and gently placed the restored medal right against the base of the white stone. For the first time since my husband took his last breath, a genuine, completely unburdened smile spread across my face. I traced my fingers over his engraved name. The battle was over. The enemy was entirely destroyed by their own blind greed. I had protected his legacy, and I had kept my promise. The profound lesson from Jocelyn's journey is that true power does not roar, it calculates. When faced with greedy relatives seeking to break your spirit, emotional outbursts only feed their egos. The ultimate defense is quiet preparation and immovable boundaries. Jocelyn proved that you never have to fight for a seat at a poisoned table. By surrendering the need to prove herself, she allowed her abuser's arrogance to become their absolute downfall. Sometimes silently walking away is the strongest counterattack. What is the hardest boundary you have set with a toxic family member? Let me know in the comments below.